Hello everyone, my name is Brian Jones. I'm 63 years old, and for most of my life, I believed that if you stayed steady, paid your share and showed up when it mattered, you earned your place in a family. I was wrong. I didn't lose my marriage in a shouting match or a courtroom. I lost it in a quiet room with folding chairs, white tablecloths, and a half-empty tray of sugar cookies. I lost it the moment my stepdaughter looked straight at me and said the greatest gift I could give her on her wedding day was to disappear from her life forever. And I lost it when my wife didn't argue, didn't defend me, didn't even hesitate, she just nodded. That nod didn't just end a conversation. It set something in motion that would unravel an entire wedding, expose years of quiet dependence, and leave people standing in the same church weeks later asking how everything fell apart so fast. They thought disappear meant I would sulk, fade, or quietly accept being erased. What they didn't understand was this: when you remove someone who's been holding things together in silence, a lot more vanishes than just a man. If you've ever felt invisible in your own family, if you've ever been treated like you were optional until you were gone, you might recognize what comes next. And before we go any further, if stories about quiet resilience, consequences, and truth resonate with you, take a second to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. Sometimes knowing you're not alone makes all the difference. That day started like any other planning meeting. We were gathered in St. Andrew's Lutheran Church, a place that smelled faintly of coffee and lemon cleaner, the kind of building where time seemed to move slower on purpose. The folding chairs scraped softly against the floor as people shifted. A wall clock ticked loud enough to be annoying if you paid attention to it. This was supposed to be simple final headcount seating arrangements, who was sitting where during the ceremony. My stepdaughter, Rachel Reynolds, stood at the front with a thick wedding binder pressed to her chest like armor. She was 28 hair, pulled back tight, efficient and confident in the way people get when they believe they're finally in control. She flipped through tabs and pages like a project manager running a meeting. My wife, Linda Reynolds, sat a few rows back, hands folded in her lap, nodding along at the right moments. I remember thinking how familiar it all felt. 12 years of marriage had trained me to read those small signals the way Linda shifted when she didn't want to choose sides, the way Rachel avoided my eyes when something uncomfortable was coming. "There's just one more thing," Rachel said, clearing her throat. The room quieted in that polite, expectant way. She glanced at her mother first, then at me. "I don't want any awkwardness on my wedding day." Linda shifted in her chair. I knew that movement. I felt it in my stomach before I understood it in my head. Rachel continued, her voice steady. "People might get confused. I mean, you're not really my dad." That part didn't hurt as much as she probably thought it would. I'd never tried to replace her father. I'd just shown up school pickups, flat tires, late-night phone calls, teaching her how to parallel park in an empty high school lot while my foot hovered calmly over the brake. For a while, she'd called me Brian. Then for a while, she'd called me Dad. Somewhere along the line, she'd stopped calling me anything at all. She took a breath, then said it. "It would mean a lot if you stepped back. Completely. The greatest gift for my wedding would be if you disappeared from our family forever." The words hung there heavier than they had any right to be. I waited for laughter, for someone to say she didn't mean it like that. I waited for Linda. 12 years of shared mornings, shared bills, shared silence. I turned toward my wife, searching her face for anything. She nodded. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't angry. It was a small, ordinary nod, the kind you give when you're agreeing to move a meeting or cancel dinner plans. But it felt like a door closing somewhere deep inside my chest. I remember noticing the clock again. Tick. 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 The room didn't erupt. No one gasped. Folding chairs creaked. Someone coughed. Life apparently was expected to continue. "All right," I said. My voice surprised even me. Rachel blinked like she'd been braced for an argument she hadn't gotten. Linda didn't say a word. That was the moment everything changed, even if none of them understood it yet. They thought the hard part was over because I hadn't fought back. They thought compliance meant weakness. What they didn't see was that I'd just accepted their request in the only way that made sense to me. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't beg. I didn't explain myself. I just stood up, nodded once, and walked out of that fellowship hall with the smell of burnt coffee still clinging to my clothes. 3 weeks later, they would be standing in that same church again, voices raised, faces tight with panic, trying to understand how a wedding could unravel, how plans so carefully organized could collapse under their own weight. But standing there that day, I didn't think about the future. I only knew one thing with absolute clarity. They had asked me to disappear, and I was done pretending I didn't know what that really meant. I didn't drive straight home after leaving the church. I sat in my truck for a while, hands resting on the steering wheel, letting the quiet settle. The request was still ringing in my ears, but beneath it was something older, heavier, the weight of 12 years that hadn't been spoken aloud in that room. Linda and I met when I was 51. She had a cautious smile and a way of listening that made you feel like you weren't wasting your words. Rachel was 16 then, tall for her age, arms crossed like she was daring the world to disappoint her. Her real father had been gone for years. I never asked why. Some stories don't belong to the man trying to step in. I didn't arrive with speeches or promises. I just showed up. I fixed the loose cabinet hinge in the kitchen the first week I stayed over. I picked Rachel up from school when Linda worked late. When her car battery died in a grocery store parking lot, I drove across town without complaining. It wasn't heroic. It was ordinary. That was the point. For a while, she called me Brian. Then one afternoon, without ceremony, she called me Dad. It happened in the middle of a sentence like she hadn't planned it. I didn't react. I'd learned that if you startled moments like that, they vanished. So I let it sit there between us, quiet and real. We moved into the house in Eden Prairie not long after the wedding. A cul-de-sac with crabapple trees and mailboxes shaped like miniature barns. I put the down payment together from savings I'd been building since my 30s. Linda added her name to the mortgage. Rachel called it the family house, especially when friends came over and she wanted to sound established. I didn't correct her. Life settled into routines. Early mornings for me, coffee before dawn, hands already buzzing from years of electrical work. I'd come home with my knuckles sore, fingers half numb, and find Rachel at the table, complaining about homework or asking for help with a project. Linda liked quiet Sundays. I liked making them quieter. When Rachel learned to drive, I took her to an empty high school parking lot. She white-knuckled the steering wheel, breath shallow, eyes wide. "Easy," I told her. "You've got time." She hit the curb once and burst into tears, convinced she'd failed forever. I waited it out, handed her a napkin, and told her to try again. She did. That was the rhythm of it. Fear, patience, progress. Money was never a conversation. Not because there wasn't any, but because I didn't want it to be leverage. The mortgage came out of my account. Insurance, utilities, repairs, it all blended together. When Rachel needed braces, I paid the deductible without announcing it. When college came, I drove her 2 hours in the snow after her car wouldn't start. She called me her hero that night, half joking, half not. I laughed it off and focused on the road. Somewhere along the line, things shifted. Rachel stopped calling me Dad. She stopped asking for rides. Linda and I talked less about the future and more about schedules. It didn't feel like rejection at first. It felt like independence. I told myself that was healthy. The wedding planning swallowed the house. Binders, color tabs, speaker phone calls that went on for hours. Linda paced the kitchen, nodding, saying, "Of course, sweetheart," while I sat at the table and paid deposits as they came up. Venue, florist, band, alterations. I didn't complain. You invest in the people you love. That's what I believed. Looking back, I can see how invisible I'd become. Not ignored exactly, more like assumed. The kind of presence you don't notice until it's gone. When Rachel talked about the wedding, she talked around me, not to me. When Linda reassured her, she did it with the confidence of someone who knew the resources would appear. Standing in that church hearing the word disappear, I understood something I hadn't let myself think before. I hadn't been replaced, I'd been absorbed. Folded into the background until my absence seemed cleaner than my presence. I drove home that evening and walked through the house slowly. The stairs creaked on the third step, like they always had. The garage shelves I'd built years ago still held the same tools, arranged the same way. Family photos lined the hallway, birthdays, holidays. Moments frozen where I stood just slightly off-center, arm around a shoulder, smiling because that's what you do. Linda watched me from the bedroom doorway while I packed a small duffel bag. Jeans, work shirts, toothbrush. I left the rest. She said my name once like she might add something after it. She didn't. I set my keys on the kitchen counter next to Rachel's wedding binder. For a second, I considered moving it just to prove I still could. Instead, I left it exactly where it was. That night, I slept in my truck behind a diner off the highway. The smell of bacon grease drifted out every time the door opened. I sat there with a cup of bad coffee, hands wrapped around it, staring at nothing. My phone buzzed with messages I didn't read. Confusion, anger, questions. I let them pile up unanswered. The next morning I went to work. Pulled wire, tightened screws. Did my job. The world didn't stop just because my place in it had shifted. During lunch, I sat in my truck and opened the mortgage app on my phone. Numbers stared back at me, steady and impersonal. I thought about the word disappear. All right, I said out loud to no one. And for the first time since leaving the church, the meaning of that answer started to take shape. By the second night, the word home had already started to feel loose, like it didn't belong to me anymore. I checked into a cheap extended stay motel on the edge of Bloomington, the kind of place designed to be forgotten. Beige walls. A bed that dipped in the middle. A small table bolted to the floor like it might run away if given the chance. The air smelled faintly of carpet cleaner, and something burned long ago. I set my duffel bag down and sat on the edge of the mattress, listening to the hum of the highway outside. I didn't turn on the television. I didn't unpack. I just sat there, hands resting on my knees, waiting for something to happen inside me. Anger, grief, relief. Anything. Nothing came. That was the strangest part. I'd always imagined loss arriving, loud shouting, slammed doors, maybe a broken plate. Instead, it was quiet. Hollow. Like someone had scooped me out and forgotten to put anything back. I lay on my back and stared at the ceiling, tracing a faint crack that ran from the light fixture toward the corner. I wondered how long it had been there, how many people had stared at it before me, wondering what they were doing in that room. My phone buzzed on the table. I didn't pick it up. It buzzed again, and again. I knew who it was without looking. Linda. Rachel. Messages stacked on top of each other, their urgency growing as my silence stretched. I turned the phone face down and slid it into the drawer. Talking was what they'd done in that church, deciding without me nodding past me. I wasn't ready to talk. The next morning, I woke before my alarm out of habit. For a few seconds, I didn't know where I was. Then the smell of stale air and the unfamiliar ceiling snapped it into place. I sat up slowly, my body already preparing for a workday it had followed for decades. Coffee first. Always coffee. The motel's coffee was thin and bitter. I drank it anyway, standing by the window, watching cars merge onto the interstate like nothing in the world had shifted. I half expected the ground to feel different under my feet. It didn't. At work, I climbed ladders and rewired panels in a strip mall renovation. Strip, twist, cap. My hands moved on autopilot muscle memory, filling the space my thoughts refused to occupy. A younger guy on the crew asked me if I was okay. I nodded. That was enough. During lunch, I sat in my truck and finally checked my phone. Missed calls, voicemails. A long text from Linda asking where I was, saying this had gone far enough that we needed to talk. Another from Rachel, sharp and confused, asking what I thought I was doing, accusing me of trying to ruin her wedding. I locked the screen without replying. Instead, I opened the mortgage app again. The numbers were familiar monthly payment interest rate remaining balance. I'd looked at them 100 times before, usually with a sense of responsibility, sometimes with quiet pride. Now they felt different. Not heavier, clearer. Disappear, I thought. All right. That afternoon I drove toward Eden Prairie without fully meaning to. I passed the exit to the house and kept going. Then I circled the block and passed it again, my blinker clicking like it was counting something down. I wasn't shaking. That surprised me. I pulled into a gas station, filled the tank, and sat there longer than necessary. An older man at the next pump nodded at me. We exchanged the kind of look men our age share, no words, just acknowledgement. Still here. Still breathing. Back at the motel that night, I lay on the bed with my hands folded on my chest, staring at the dark. Memories drifted in without permission. Rachel at 8, clutching my hand in a mall parking lot because she was afraid of getting lost. Linda asleep on the couch, head tipped back, trusting me to wake her when it was time to go to bed. The house and winter driveway already shoveled before dawn so no one would slip. I didn't push the memories away. I didn't chase them either. I let them pass through one by one like cars on the highway outside. On the third day, I went back to the house while Linda was at work. I still had the spare key. The door opened with the same familiar resistance. Inside, the rooms felt staged like a house waiting for new owners. I packed a few more things, my toolbox, an old flannel jacket, a framed photo of my father. I didn't touch anything that screamed husband. The matching mugs. The throw blanket Linda liked. Rachel's wedding binder sat on the counter exactly where I'd left it. I closed it gently. When Linda came home that evening, my side of the closet was empty. She stood in the doorway, arms crossed. "You're really doing this?" she said. "I am. You're punishing us." I looked at her, then really looked. The lines around her mouth. The way she avoided my eyes. "No," I said quietly. "I'm stepping back. Like you wanted." Her face changed, not anger, not sadness, uncertainty, like she just realized something was moving that she couldn't stop. That night back in the motel, the hollow feeling shifted. It didn't disappear. It settled. Became something I could carry without collapsing under it. I sat at the small table and wrote a list on the back of an envelope. Not feelings, facts, accounts, documents. Next steps. For the first time since leaving the church, I wasn't just enduring the silence, I was listening to it. And in that quiet, something firm began to take shape, slowly, deliberately, like a decision that didn't need anger to survive. The next morning, I woke with a sense of direction that hadn't been there before. Not anger, not resolve in the dramatic sense, just clarity. The hollow space was still inside me, but now it had edges. I showered, dressed for work, then stopped halfway through tying my boots. Instead of heading to the job site, I drove toward the Wells Fargo branch in Eden Prairie, the brick building with the flags out front. I'd passed 100 times without thinking. That alone told me something had changed. I wasn't running. I was choosing. Inside, the air smelled like carpet cleaner and printer toner. A young teller smiled, the practiced smile of someone trained to make transactions feel friendly. "How can I help you? I need to review some accounts," I said. "Joint ones." She nodded, asked for my ID, and tapped at her keyboard. The screen reflected in her glasses as she pulled things up. Checking, savings, the account we'd been using for wedding expenses. Everything looked exactly as it always had. Same balances, same automatic payments scheduled like clockwork. I didn't close anything. Not yet. I asked questions instead. About access, about authority, about what required 2 signatures and what didn't. She answered calmly, professionally, unaware that each sentence was loosening something that had been knotted for years. When I stepped back outside, I sat on the bench near the entrance and watched cars roll through the parking lot. A woman struggled to buckle a toddler into a car seat. Someone laughed too loudly inside the building. Life again refused to acknowledge my private earthquake. I felt older than I had the day before. Not weaker, just more aware. From there I drove across town to a small real estate office with a faded sign I'd always meant to repaint, but never got around to. Andrew Collins had been working as a realtor longer than I'd known him as a neighbor's friend. We'd exchange nods at block parties, small talk over fences. Nothing deep. He looked up when I walked in. "Brian," he said, surprised. "You okay? I need to sell my house." He didn't ask why. He gestured for me to sit. Coffee appeared burnt and familiar. He flipped through paperwork, eyes moving quickly, then leaned back in his chair. "You're serious?" "I am." He studied me for a moment. Fast sale or top dollar, I didn't hesitate. Clean, quick, under asking if that's what it takes. That got his attention. You know what that means. I do. There was no satisfaction in saying it, no thrill, just acceptance. The house wasn't a trophy, it was a chapter, and I was ready to close it without dragging it through appeals and delays. Signing the listing agreement felt heavier than I expected. Not because I doubted it, but because it made everything tangible. This wasn't silence anymore. It was action. On the way out, my phone buzzed. Linda's name lit the screen. I let it ring. Talking would come later, or it wouldn't. Either way, this didn't require permission. That afternoon, I stopped at a gas station and filled the truck, then sat there with the engine off, watching the numbers climb and reset. I thought about the years I'd measured my worth in reliability, showing up, paying on time, keeping things running. I'd confused usefulness with belonging. It was an easy mistake to make when no one corrected you. Back at the motel, I spread papers across the small table. Mortgage statements, insurance documents, old folders I'd kept out of habit, never imagining they'd matter this way. I wasn't building a case. I was inventorying reality. If you've ever had a moment where you realized you were holding everything together for people who had already stepped away, you probably understand this feeling. If this part of the story speaks to you, feel free to share your thoughts in the comments, and if you'd like to support stories like this, a simple like always helps. The phone buzzed again. This time I picked it up. "This has gone far enough," Linda said, her voice tight. "You're tearing everything down." "I'm stepping back," I replied, keeping my voice even. "Like you asked." "That's not what we meant." I thought of the church, the folding chairs, the nod. "It's what you said." She was quiet for a moment. "You're punishing us." "No," I said. "I'm choosing myself." She hung up. By evening, Andrew texted me a photo. A sign staked into the front lawn of the house. "For sale." Bright letters, wide-angle optimism. The lawn looked greener than I remembered. My phone exploded. Calls, messages. Rachel's voice in a voicemail, sharp with panic, then fury. Linda's texts, softer, pleading. A call from someone at the wedding venue, asking who still had authority to approve events at the house. I let them all go unanswered, not because I wanted them to suffer, because this wasn't a conversation anymore. It was a consequence unfolding at its own pace. That night, lying on the motel bed, I felt something settle into place. Not triumph, not relief, control, quiet, steady control. I'd accepted a loss to end something that had already ended without me. They'd asked me to disappear. I was simply making sure I did it properly. The sign went up on a Thursday morning. I know because Andrew texted me a photo just after 9, the sun still low enough to cast long shadows across the lawn. For sale, bold and cheerful, staked into the grass like it had always belonged there. The house looked better in the picture than it ever had in real life, wider, brighter, more inviting. Wide-angle lenses have a way of telling generous lies. By noon, my phone felt heavier in my pocket, buzzing every few minutes like it was trying to crawl out. I didn't answer it. I didn't need to. I could already imagine the scene back at the house, Linda pacing the kitchen, Rachel standing frozen wedding binder open on the counter as if the pages might rearrange themselves into a solution. The first call I listened to was from the wedding venue. The woman on the line sounded polite, but confused. "We're calling because there seems to be some uncertainty about the property being used for the rehearsal dinner," she said. With the house listed, we need confirmation from the homeowner and updated proof of insurance. There's no uncertainty, I replied. The house is being sold. Silence stretched on the line. Then carefully. In that case, we won't be able to proceed. I understand, I said, and meant it. When I hung up, my hands were shaking not with fear, but with adrenaline. This wasn't abstract anymore. This was movement. Consequences, leaving messages of their own. By late afternoon, the calls multiplied. A florist asking about deposits. A caterer leaving a voicemail, polite but edged with concern. Someone from the band wanting to know who was responsible for the outstanding balance. Each call felt like another tile slipping loose, the pattern of the wedding floor beginning to crack. Rachel's messages changed tone. The anger gave way to panic. "You can't do this," she said in one voicemail, her voice unsteady. "Do you know how this looks?" In another, she accused me of trying to embarrass her, of making everything about myself. I sat on the edge of the motel bed and listened without interrupting, like I was overhearing a storm through a wall. When the messages ended, the room felt too quiet. I turned on the television just for the noise. A weather forecast droned on about storms that might or might not arrive. That evening, Linda showed up at the motel without calling. She knocked until I opened the door, eyes bright, jaw set. "You're tearing everything down," she said, stepping inside, like she still belonged there. "For what, I'm ending it," I replied. "Honestly." She laughed, then sharp and brittle. "You think this will end well?" "I think it will end," I said. "That's enough." She stared at me like she didn't recognize the man standing there. Maybe she didn't. The version of me she'd known depended on endurance. This one didn't. The next day, Andrew called with news. "We've got interest," he said cautiously. "Quick, it's under asking. Accept it," I said without asking how far under. He paused. "You're sure?" "Yes." Hanging up, I felt the weight of finality settle into my chest. Not dread, just the understanding that the bridge was burning behind me and I wasn't turning around to watch. The offer moved fast. Too fast for anyone trying to catch up. Linda called again, her voice smaller this time. "The venue canceled the rehearsal dinner," she said. "They said without the house." "I know," I replied. "You're destroying her dream." "No," I said quietly. "I'm stepping out of it." Rachel called from a number I didn't recognize. I answered before I could stop myself. "You sold the house," she yelled. "Are you insane? I told you I was disappearing," I said. "You did this on purpose." "Yes," I replied, surprised by how calm the truth sounded. "I did." She cried. Then the sound raw and furious, like something tearing. "You're ruining my wedding." "This isn't revenge," I said. "It's consequences." She hung up. By Monday, the word postponed began circulating. Not canceled. Not yet. Postponed, like they were leaving the door cracked in case things settled. Rachel posted something vague online about toxic people and setting boundaries. Friends and family filled the comments with encouragement, unaware of how thin the story really was. The neighborhood noticed. A neighbor texted me to ask if everything was okay. Another stopped Andrew during a showing and whispered something I didn't hear. During one open house, voices were raised, doors slammed. Someone cried on the front steps while strangers pretended not to look. The house, once quiet and predictable, became a stage for things that had been hidden too long. At work, I climbed ladders and rewired panels like nothing else existed. Strip. Twist. Cap. The rhythm grounded me. During lunch, I ate a dry sandwich in my truck and watched a young couple argue in the parking lot. The woman waved her arms. The man stared at the ground. I wondered which one I'd been all those years. That night, alone in the motel, I pulled an old photo from my wallet. Rachel at 17, sitting in the driver's seat of my truck, grinning like she'd just won something. I held it for a long time, listening to the vending machine hum down the hall. The dominoes were still falling. I could hear them, one after another, even if I couldn't see where they'd stop. And as the noise built, I realized something that surprised me. I didn't feel victorious. I felt steady. If you've ever watched something unravel and recognized pieces of your own life in it, you can tell me in the comments. I'm listening. The sale closed on a Tuesday morning. I remember that because of the sound the pen made when I signed the last page, a soft scratch, nothing dramatic. Andrew slid the papers into a neat stack and tapped the corner straight. "That's it," he said. "You're done. 12 years of mortgage payments. 12 winters of shoveling the driveway before dawn. 12 summers mowing the lawn while Rachel sat on the porch scrolling her phone asking if I'd seen her sunglasses. All of it reduced to a signature and a handshake." I walked out of the title office into a parking lot full of ordinary cars. A minivan honked. Someone argued with their phone. The world didn't pause to acknowledge that something I'd built was officially no longer mine. Andrew clapped me lightly on the shoulder. "You all right, I will be," I said, and believed it enough to mean it. The call came before I reached the end of the block. Linda's name lit up the screen. I answered. "What did you do?" she asked, breathless. "I sold the house." "You can't." "I did." There was a beat of silence, then her voice dropped. "The venue just called me. They cancelled the rehearsal dinner. They said without the property, I figured they would," I said. "You're destroying her dream." "No," I replied. "I'm stepping out of it." By afternoon, the rest followed. The florist cancelled. The band left a voicemail about the deposit. The caterer asked who was responsible for the outstanding balance. The word postponed lost its usefulness. There were too many missing pieces to pretend this was temporary. I didn't go back to the house while the buyers prepared to move in. I didn't need to. I'd already been there once alone earlier that week. The rooms were stripped bare, the air smelling faintly of dust and lemon cleaner. My footsteps echoed like I was walking through someone else's memory. I brought one box with me that day. It wasn't heavy, just paper. I set it on the kitchen counter right where Linda used to lay out bills and Rachel spread her binders. The counter still had a faint scratch from the time I dropped a screwdriver years ago. I'd meant to sand it down. Never got around to it. Inside the box was a single binder, black, thick, the kind accountants use. On the spine in block letters I'd written what it was. Inside were tabs clean and labeled, mortgage payments, insurance and utilities, education and medical, wedding expenses, extras, no opinions, no insults, just facts, copies of checks, statements, notes in my handwriting, dates, amounts, quiet annotations I'd never expected anyone else to read. Under extras I'd added things Rachel had forgotten. Gas money from college trips home, insurance deductibles. The winter I covered her rent when her roommate bailed. On top of the binder, I placed a single envelope addressed to Rachel. Not Linda. Rachel. The letter was one page, not long. "You asked me to disappear. This is what disappears when I do. There's no anger in this, just accounting. I hope your wedding day is still beautiful. I won't be there to see it." I stood there longer than I needed to. Long enough to hear a car pass outside. Long enough to feel the years settle in my shoulders. Then I left. I didn't tell anyone I'd been there. The call came that afternoon. It wasn't Linda. It was Daniel Brooks, Rachel's fiancé. I'd met him twice, polite, quiet, the kind of man who let things happen around him and called it peace. "What is this?" he asked, his voice tight. "Open it," I said. There was a pause. Paper shifting. A sharp breath. "Jesus," he muttered. I could hear voices in the background. Linda crying. Rachel's voice rising sharp and panicked. "This is manipulative," she said. "He planned this." "I documented it," I replied. "There's a difference. You're trying to embarrass us." Linda sobbed. "I'm telling the truth," I said publicly for the first time. They were in the house then, the empty one. Neighbors drifting past. The new owners not due until the next day. Sunlight spilled across the counter where the binder lay. I imagined Rachel flipping through it, her fingers stopping on numbers she'd never noticed before. The monthly mortgage, The interest rate, the braces, the venue deposit, all paid from the same place. Daniel breathed into the phone slow and heavy. "Did you know about all this?" he asked Rachel. Silence answered him. That silence was louder than any yelling could have been. Later, I heard what happened next from a neighbor. Rachel threw the binder across the room. Pages spilled. Numbers fluttered like leaves. Daniel picked them up one by one. People watched from a polite distance, the way Midwesterners do, concerned, curious, restrained. Someone whispered. Someone else shook their head. "I always thought Brian paid for everything a woman said." "He did," another replied. By evening, the story had spread. Church friends, wedding guests, people who'd wondered why the wedding was suddenly on hold. There was no rumor to correct. The truth was already labeled, tabbed, and laid out on the counter. Linda called again that night. I didn't answer. I sat on the porch of my small rental, a folding chair pulled close to the railing. The sky turned the color of rusted copper as the sun dipped low. Somewhere a lawnmower droned. A dog barked once, then settled. I didn't feel victorious. I felt clean. For weeks I'd been disappearing piece by piece, quietly, legally. One support removed at a time. This wasn't a final strike. It was the moment everything they'd leaned on became visible all at once. They had my absence. Now they had the truth that came with it. The fallout didn't arrive all at once. It moved the way weather does, quiet at first, then everywhere. By the next morning, my phone held messages from numbers I didn't recognize. Church friends. A cousin I hadn't spoken to in years. Someone who started with, "I don't know if this is my place," and then went on for 3 paragraphs. I didn't answer any of them. Not because I was hiding, but because the story didn't need my commentary. It was already complete. What surprised me wasn't the attention. It was the tone. There was no outrage directed at me, no accusations of cruelty or manipulation. Mostly there were questions. Is it true? Did you really pay for all of it? How long did this go on? Questions people ask when something they assume turns out to be wrong. Linda went quiet. The pleading stopped. The calls thinned out until they disappeared entirely. Silence, I learned, has different textures. This one felt brittle, like it could crack if touched. Rachel tried to control the narrative. She posted again online longer this time about boundaries and toxic relationships and choosing herself. The comments filled quickly, supportive words, heart emojis, a few carefully worded prayers. But the post didn't land the way she wanted it to. Too many people had already seen the binder. Too many had done the math for themselves. Neighbors talked, not loudly, not unkindly. In driveways and grocery store aisles, in the polite half-whispers of people who didn't want to gossip but needed to understand. I wasn't there to hear most of it. I didn't need to be. Andrew mentioned it when we spoke briefly about the last paperwork detail. People noticed, he said. More than you think. At work, a guy I'd known for years clapped me on the shoulder and said, "That took guts." I didn't correct him. Didn't correct. It hadn't felt like courage. It had felt like exhaustion finally given a direction. The wedding didn't get canceled. Not officially. It was postponed. That word did a lot of work for a while. Vendors used it carefully, like a promise they didn't want to break. But dates slipped. Deposits stayed where they were. Schedules dissolved. You can't build momentum on hesitation. I heard about the first real crack through someone else. A text from Peter Lawson, the neighbor I'd exchanged nods with for years. "Didn't seem right you not being around," he wrote. "Just checking in." I stared at that message longer than I should have. A neighbor had noticed my absence before my own family did. A few days later, the email came from Daniel Brooks. It was short, direct, no excuses. I didn't know it began. "I'm sorry. I don't think we're ready to get married." I read it twice, then closed the laptop. There was no rush of vindication, no satisfaction, just a quiet acknowledgement of reality catching up to itself. Daniel had been polite from the start, agreeable in a way that made it easy for things to happen around him. Seeing the numbers, the history, the imbalance, he'd finally been forced to choose whether peace was worth the cost of pretending. Rachel didn't take it quietly. That much filtered back to me through second-hand accounts. Raised voices, accusations, doors slammed. A woman crying on the front steps while people pretended not to look. It sounded familiar, that scene. Like the church, but louder. Linda showed up once more late in the evening when the air had started to cool and the leaves were gathering along the curb outside my rental. She stood on the porch with her coat pulled tight, eyes tired. "I never thought you'd go this far," she said. "I never thought you'd nod," I replied. The words landed between us, heavy, but clean. She looked past me into the small living room, the second-hand couch, the lamp I'd fixed myself, the place that belonged only to me now. "You seem different," she said. "I am." She nodded then. The same small nod. This one didn't hurt. It didn't matter anymore. By Sunday, the binder was gone. The new owners had moved in. The counter was theirs now. But the work had already been done. You can't put numbers back once they've been read. You can't unsee the weight someone carried when it's finally set down in public. Weeks passed. Then months. Summer slid into fall. I settled into a rhythm that felt earned. Up at 5:30, coffee by the window, headlights moving along the road like a slow river. Some mornings I missed the house. Some mornings I didn't. Both felt honest. The community adjusted. People stopped asking questions. The story found its shape and stayed there. Not as scandal. As understanding. Respect doesn't announce itself. It shows up quietly after everything else falls away. I thought about Rachel sometimes. Not with anger. With a distant kind of sadness. I hope she learned something from it all. I hope she didn't have to lose as much as I did to understand it. But that part wasn't mine anymore. I hadn't shouted. I hadn't demanded apologies. I hadn't asked anyone to choose me. I'd simply stepped back and let the truth hold its own weight. And watching the ripples move outward through relationships, reputations, assumptions, I understood something clearly. This wasn't revenge. It was what happens when silence finally stops doing the work for everyone else. And as the noise faded and life settled into its new shape, I found myself standing in a place I hadn't expected, alone, yes, but steady, ready to move forward without needing anyone else to explain what had already been made plain. I moved out of the motel on a quiet Monday, the kind of day that doesn't ask for attention. The rental I'd found sat at the edge of town, a modest place with thin walls and a small porch just big enough for a chair. When I carried my duffel bag inside, the rooms echoed not because they were empty, but because they were new. Nothing in them belonged to anyone else yet. The first night I sat on the porch and listened. Traffic hummed in the distance. A dog barked once, then settled. Somewhere down the block someone laughed. There were no raised voices, no wedding plans spread across a counter, no binders waiting to be opened. Just quiet. Not the hollow kind I'd felt in the motel. This was different. This quiet didn't take anything from me. It gave something back. I fell into a rhythm faster than I expected. Up at 5:30 like always. Coffee loud and old, but dependable. I drank the first cup standing by the window, watching headlights move along the road like a slow river. Work stayed steady. My hands still buzzed at night from years of pulling wire, but I slept better than I had in a long time. Honest tiredness replaces a lot of noise. One afternoon in October, Peter Lawson stopped by. He stood on the porch with his hands in his jacket pockets, shifting his weight. Just wanted to say he began, then paused. "A lot of folks saw what you did." I waited. "Not the selling part," he said. "The other part. The truth." I nodded. He didn't need me to explain it, and I didn't need him to approve it. When he left, I sat back down and looked out at the trees. For the first time, I understood something I'd missed for years. Respect doesn't make announcements. It arrives quietly after everything else falls away. Linda tried once more near Thanksgiving. She showed up without calling, coat pulled tight, eyes tired in a way that told me she'd been carrying something heavy for a long time. "I didn't think you'd really go through with it," she said. I did. She looked past me into the living room, taking in the second-hand couch, the lamp I'd fixed myself, the space that no longer required permission. "You seem settled," she said. "I am." She nodded the same small nod. This one didn't close a door. It just acknowledged that it was already closed. "I hope you're happy," she said. "I'm at peace," I replied. She left without another word. When the door closed, I didn't feel relief or regret, just acceptance. Some chapters don't need a dramatic ending to be finished. That winter, I bought a place of my own. Smaller than the old house, paid for outright, a modest porch, a yard just big enough to rake without cursing. On the first night there, I sat outside with a mug of tea and watched the sun sink behind the trees. No applause, no audience, just the sound of leaves moving in the wind. I thought about Rachel sometimes, not with anger, with a distant, careful sadness. I hoped she learned something from it all. I hoped she didn't have to lose as much as I did to understand the weight of what had been carried for her. But that lesson, whatever shape it took, wasn't mine to teach anymore. What I took with me wasn't money or property or even vindication. I took my dignity. I took my time. I took the truth of who I was and who I'd been all along. I stopped measuring my worth by how much I could absorb without complaint. I stopped mistaking endurance for love. They asked me to disappear. What they never understood was this. When you push someone out who's been holding everything together, you don't just lose them. You lose the weight they carried in silence. And once that weight is set down, it doesn't vanish. It becomes visible. Life didn't transform overnight. It softened. The edges smoothed. Mornings felt lighter. Evenings stretched without tension. Some days I missed the old house. Some days I didn't. Both were true, and both were allowed. If this story stirred something in you, if you've ever felt unseen, taken for granted, or quietly erased, I hope you know you're not alone. Sometimes the strongest response isn't shouting back or proving a point. Sometimes it's choosing yourself without needing permission. If you found meaning here, consider liking the video, sharing it with someone who might need it, subscribing for more stories like this, and leaving a comment if you feel comfortable. Your voice matters even when it's quiet. As for me, I'm still here, still breathing, still building a life that fits the shape I've earned. And for the first time in a long while, the silence around me doesn't feel like absence. It feels like home.